Okay, so yes, this are pictures of my research that happened in the Bay with the lovely help of some students and Allie, who's here in the room with us. But yeah, moving on. So if you have kept up on the news, you may have seen some recent headlines from across the country about green crabs. The first thing that you'll notice is that there's a lot of use of words like threat, invasion, decline, all linked to green crabs. So from New England to Washington to Alaska, these crabs are causing problems around the world and have been for decades. So the green crab is a notorious invasive species. And so I wanted to define invasive before going much further. So invasive species has a particular meaning, and that is that it is a species that causes economic and environmental harm to a new area that it has been introduced to. I also want to reiterate that not all non-native species are invasive. Many of our agricultural crops and are non-native but not invasive. So there has been some talk in the scientific community to change this language to make it less confusing. Some have moved to using language like aggressor species to more clearly make the point of there being some species that we need to potentially monitor more than others. But what about green crabs? How do you identify green crabs? These crabs are native to the Baltic Sea and Northeast Atlantic Ocean in Europe. Hence, it used to be called the European green crab, though we're moving away from using geographic location in their common names. But yes, their common name, the green crab, is not very apt. It's not always green. Sometimes their undersides are orange, they can be red, they can be brown. So the best way to actually identify green crabs is by the 5 spines on each side of their eyes, which I've circled here on the PowerPoint. They also have 3 bumps in between their eyes. So definitely, if you're trying to look for green crabs, this is the best way to identify them. The average size of these crabs ranges from 2.5 to 3.5 inches, but can reach upwards of 4.5 inches in size, especially here on the West Coast. They actually grow larger here on the West Coast than they do anywhere else in the world. And that measurement is measured from 5th spine to 5th spine. So I have that here in the white line. A female can spawn up to 185,000 eggs and can have 1 to 2 clutches a year. And a clutch is just a batch of eggs. And these crabs can live up to 6 years. So you will typically find them in the rocky intertidal, tidal marsh, or mudflats and eelgrass beds, though adult green crabs do go to deeper waters during the winter. Their diet consists of bivalves like clams and oysters. They will eat marine worms, also known as polychaetes, and other small crabs and amphipods. Bays on the East Coast have seen pretty detrimental impacts to their shellfish numbers when green crab populations were abundant. Studies have shown that green crabs can eat anywhere from 20 small clams a day to even 40 small clams a day. So that is a lot of eating, much more than our native crabs would be doing. And this is problematic on the West Coast too, because their green crab diets do overlap with other crabs like Dungeness. And in food limited situations, green crabs might be able to outcompete Dungeness crabs or other native crabs, in addition to having negative impacts on our shellfish abundance. So I mentioned that green crabs are native to Europe in the North Atlantic and Baltic Sea, but how did they get here? They were first documented in the early 1800s on the east coast of North America, likely making their way over in the hulls of ships. We see they slowly dispersed north across the east coast, reaching Maine in the 1950s, where they were blamed for the collapse of the soft-shell clam industry, and then eventually reaching Newfoundland in Canada in 2007. Green crabs were first documented on the West Coast in 1980. Once again, probably arriving via ships. They moved north really quickly, reaching Oregon in 1997, Washington in 1998, and British Columbia in 1999, and most recently Alaska as of this year. So their dispersal on the West Coast does seem to correlate with El Nino events. And El Nino is when we have periods of warm water in the Pacific Ocean. And so green crab eggs, or like newly hatched crabs from established populations, travel along these strong ocean currents northward. And generally speaking, green crabs are very tolerant of a wide range of temperatures and salinities. And so that has likely allowed them to invade coasts on every continent that they are not native to. So what specifically makes these crabs such a threat? To start, these crabs significantly alter any ecosystem that they are introduced to. So you see here, they've dug kind of a major burrow here in the mud flat, but they also can affect our eelgrass. So they do this through their foraging. They not only clip and eat the above ground vegetation, but they will uproot the entire plant as they dig for clams or other prey underneath. They also will burrow themselves into the mud at low tide or just to hide from predators. So you can see that as that burrowing behavior with the red arrows. And so that is not good for eelgrass cover and health. So this type of behavior would not be a huge issue if populations were kept in check, but if left unmonitored, habitat like eelgrass, which is critical habitat for Dungeness crab, migrating birds, salmon, and which are very plentiful here in Oregon, they are put at risk. So this picture shows Casco Bay in Maine from 2001, a very well-established, healthy eelgrass bed, and then the same bay in 2013. And so we see a huge loss in eelgrass cover, which was ultimately tied to green crabs. And so I'm going to take a second to kind of rave about eelgrass and just why it's so critical. Seagrass beds like ours were once very plentiful, but 250,000 acres have been lost in the last 30 years. So that's a very similar rate to the loss of coral reefs and tropical rainforests. And similarly to those habitats, once these beds are gone, they are very difficult to recover. Recovery is very slow and restoration has pretty varying success, and it's also very costly. So there have been estimates between $100,000 and even $1 million per acre for restoration of eelgrass. So the best management strategy here is definitely preserving our eelgrass beds, which is what my experiment sought to contribute to, is how can we conserve our eelgrass beds in the face of an increasing green crab population and, you know, be able to prioritize areas for trapping and areas for keeping a healthy eelgrass. So if the green crabs are disrupting the ecosystem, this is going to affect many other species that rely on it for habitat. So our native crab, fish, and birds could all be at risk. I mentioned before that these crabs have a pretty voracious appetite. So 20 clams a day could have detrimental impacts to our crab, oyster, and clam fisheries and aquaculture operations. This may seem an exaggeration, but if we do look to the East Coast as an example, green crabs have been blamed for the collapse of the softshell clam industry and have continued to negatively affect aquaculture operations even more recently. And another threat that we need to consider is that these crabs are coming from a different ecosystem, which often have different pathogens. And so introducing them into a new area means our native wildlife may not have the immune system to fight it off, or have not seen something that their body will be able to handle. The original hope when green crabs first were detected in the Pacific Northwest is that populations would go extinct once they reached the end of their lifespan. And up until 2002, populations were fairly low. So I have there about 0.5 crabs per trap, which is low. But then between 2015 and 2018, there started to be an increased catch rate of green crabs across estuaries. In 2019, 2,000 crabs were caught in Washington and Oregon. And in 2020, Coos Bay, 77% of the crabs that they caught were green crabs. So I'm going to pull up a graph here, which at first looks a little overwhelming, but I'm going to walk through it. The different colors here are the different bays that were monitored for green crabs in different colors. And then this black line is water temperature. And so it's across from 1998 when they first showed up in Oregon to 2021. And so, as I said before, it was pretty, after they first arrived, populations were fairly low. We have a little bit of a bump here, but it was really in 2015 when we see this huge increase in green crabs, and that correlated with a El Nino event, so really warm waters, which drastically increased green crab populations directly afterwards. And that kind of continues to be a trend. So researchers are able to predict fairly consistently what the next year might bring for green crab populations based off of how warm the water was. And abundance, comparatively speaking, to the East Coast is still fairly low in Oregon, and even comparing Oregon to California, but populations are growing, and green crabs do have a 6-year lifespan. So the crabs that are currently here are going to be supplying eggs until 2028. So now that I have maybe potentially overwhelmed you with bad news, I'm going to go through what can be done about it. And I'm going to start off with some simple things that you can do if you're a recreational fisher or shellfisher, or even if you just eat shellfish. And to start, the main and best thing you can do is to know how to identify green crabs from other native crabs. So in Oregon, you are prohibited from returning a green crab to the water if you caught one while crabbing. However, we don't want native crabs like kelp crabs or shore crabs to be mistakenly killed if someone thinks they are a green crab. Oregon has been hesitant to actually increase their daily bag limit just because they know that crabs are so often mistaken for one another. Secondly, do clean your boat. Moving boats from water body to water body is obviously a great vector for introducing new species to new areas. So this is applicable for more than just crabs. Larvae could easily be carried in any water taken up from the bay. And beyond that, adult green crabs are very fast and aggressive and remarkably resilient. They can survive out of water for much longer durations than other crabs. They can tolerate heat. And so they have done just fine hanging out in the back of my car for 2 hours going back to Portland. And I am pretty sure that a small crab even escaped out under our fridge at one point. So they can definitely hang out in your boat and escape when they feel like they might be able to escape. Next, yes, I mentioned this just before. Do not return green crabs back to the water after being caught. It is illegal to put them back in the water. One crab may not seem like a huge issue at the time, but if you throw back a female in the water, that's 185,000 potential eggs for the future if she were to spawn. Lastly, do not put store-bought shellfish or shells purchased elsewhere out on the beach. And so that is just because larvae could be hanging out on those shellfish or shells, or even potentially other invasive species. So it's just best to store them at home and not potentially introduce it into a new area. So this brings me to, can I eat these crabs? And so the answer is most definitely yes. These crabs are smaller and have a tougher shell than a Dungeness crab, but they are described as having a complex and delicate flavor that doesn't overbear a dish. So there has been a whole cookbook dedicated to green crabs with recipes like crab scampi, crab fritters, and many more, which look very tasty. I was going through it myself. And also, it's drinkable now. So Tamworth Distilling in Maine has created a whiskey out of green crabs, with the sole purpose being to find a use for the state's unwanted green crab population, which is currently, as they write, wreaking havoc on New England's coastal ecosystem. I am very curious to try this and see what it tastes like. And I just wanted to put a bit of a caution notice out too before you run out and start looking for green crabs. I do want to say that they are very feisty and can be aggressive. So watch out for your fingers while interacting with them. While their claws are not as strong as an adult red rock crab, they are, in my experience, much more energetic and quick. So you can see here, we were just trying to put this green crab into a bag and he was having none of it. So we actually had to use calipers to be able to hold him. And this was a crab that I was hoping to put into my enclosure, but he was very aggressive. He has that aggressive stance with his claws kind of and his body upright, and then a very quick jab with both of his claws. I'm not actually sure how I ended up getting him out of the bucket, but it was scary. However, I had to do it. Okay, so beyond what you can do, you're probably wondering what the state of Oregon is doing to tackle this threat, and even what is the rest of the Pacific Northwest doing. So Oregon, like I said, has actually recently increased their daily bag limit for green crabs to 35, and I think that's up from 10. So you do need a shellfish permit. There's no commercial harvesting of green crabs, and there still is a limit of 35, even though they are an invasive species, and that is just because, like I said, people mistake them for native crabs. Oregon is also, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife has partnered with other agencies to monitor and research green crabs in the hopes of understanding and being able to create future management plans. Washington has actually a pretty aggressive management policy in place. Washington's Governor Inslee declared a state of emergency for green crabs, which opened up funding for the Washington Green Crab Team. And they do extensive monitoring, trapping, and research. They've also trained volunteers for early detection. California, on the other hand, has a pretty loose management program in place with kind of a live and let live policy. So catching green crabs is considered part of their regular crab catch bag limit. Otherwise, there is a team of scientists regularly trapping and conducting research in Bodega Harbor. And Alaska had set up an early detection program in 2020. And the Alaska Department of Fish and Game has expanded that trapping effort, I'm sure, especially since green crabs were just discovered in this year in Alaska. So we've seen the variety of strategies that different states are taking in terms of green crab management. Is one working better than another? Does the East Coast have any lessons that we can learn from? Is there anything that scientists are specifically calling for? And it is hard to say whether one state is doing a better job than another, and that is because populations of green crabs are fairly new to the West Coast. So it is hard to see trends or strategies that are working just yet. It's also not that useful to look at the East Coast for how to handle this situation because the green crabs were left, populations they were left unchecked, and it was unknown just how destructive they were until populations were kind of very extreme. And it was very difficult to do any sort of population control at that point. So a group of researchers did create a proposal for green crab management back in 2002. It called for prevention, eradication, and other control measures. It called for more education and outreach and creating a model that could predict where and when invasions could occur. So since then, since 2002, models have been created to predict where green crabs will occur. And I believe those researchers have learned a lot about green crabs and how best to manage them. So a lot of these things that I'm going to go through are what I have taken from literature, but also some of which are just my own opinion. So I think rather than having all states be doing their own sort of management practice, that doing a region-wide management plan would benefit everyone. Obviously, having Washington do such a aggressive trapping and management is not necessarily going to do much if Oregon is not doing anything, and we're just going to be continuing to seed new populations in Washington with how the ocean currents work. And so, yeah, hoping that Oregon will do a little bit more. Obviously, not managing for green crabs means endangering vulnerable ecosystems, not just in Oregon, but up and down the coast. The population of green crabs in Oregon at this point appears to be established and growing. So population control through trapping to minimize impacts is crucial. So part of that is encouraging the public to eat green crabs. And if you're not into eating green crabs, then I would say they're a great fertilizer to add to the garden. Both of these things would help keep populations in check. Another potential strategy is restricting shellfish transport between estuaries, and treating ballast water. So I had mentioned before that boats have often been a huge vector for green crabs, and humans in general are often the cause of introducing new invasive species. So we do have, I believe, restrictions already in place between shellfish transport between states, but making that slightly even more aggressive with a little bit more restriction even between estuaries. And obviously continuing to do more research and monitoring. Green crabs will behave differently in different habitats, with different predators and even different environmental variables happening. And so it's very crucial also to know where they are in order to be able to do trapping and do research. We need to first know where green crabs even are. And then lastly, creating resources that is more accessible so that the public can do crab identification when they're out doing shellfishing or crabbing, so that we're not taking out our native crabs, and people can more accurately identify green crabs, the bad ones. And just some last considerations for green crabs is that at this point, complete eradication is not feasible. And that is just because, like I said, the larvae that travel on ocean currents can seed estuaries from hundreds of miles away. And I will talk about this a little bit more, but with aggressive trapping, we've actually seen kind of boom in populations afterwards. And we'll talk about that in a second. Climate change will very likely benefit green crabs while being negative for our native crab populations. So green crabs are very tolerant of warm water, different salinities, different habitats. I didn't mention, but green crabs have been shown to actually be able to absorb nutrients through their gills, which is not something that crabs can normally do. So they can go long bouts without actually needing to ingest anything, as they're just absorbing nutrients from the water. So yeah, they are incredibly resilient. Yes, so trapping adult crabs can actually lead to an increase in green crabs later. A researcher in California did a huge trapping effort about a decade ago and removed most of the crabs. They got it down to, I believe, like less than 10,000, which was huge for that area. And then they realized a few years later that the population had, for some reason, boomed after that, and that they realized that by taking out the adult crabs, they had actually left all of the baby crabs. So they realized that the adult crabs actually cannibalize the small larvae and keep the population of the larvae in check by doing that. And so when you trap the adult crabs, you take away that check. So those larvae all grew up to be a huge population boom for green crabs later. Yes, and like I had mentioned, there is not going to be a no one size fits all management strategy for green crabs, just because different areas have different habitats, predators, food availability, and so we're going to have to be able to adapt and be flexible about how we handle green crabs in different estuaries, different regions. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments if people have them. You may have complicated feelings of whether to be impressed or terrified of green crabs like me, but yes, I am interested to hear what everyone has to say.
Thank you, Kim. We did get a couple questions. So one question was, how much do we know about the impact of green crabs on native Dungeness in Oregon bays or in the ocean?
They're doing quite a bit of research, I would say, on that now and continuing forward. That is a huge issue that they want to know about. They do know that green crabs will predate on young Dungeness crabs. And then once Dungeness kind of get to the point of being bigger than green crabs, that Dungeness will predate on younger green crabs. But I think at this point, when there's large populations of green crabs, that can be very detrimental to Dungeness populations.
Interesting. the next question I had is specifically about netarts and what
Mm.
impacts you saw on eelgrass in the bay. Kind of recapping that.
Yeah, so I was looking across the impacts of different densities of eelgrass. So low density, or I would guess coverage, I would say percent cover is kind of what I was looking at. And so I didn't find I would say of like a major trend, just because I wasn't able to do enough replicates of that study with how much time I had. But what I did see is that green crabs do have a larger effect on low density eelgrass. So their behavior, their foraging is much more noticeable. They're, when they're trying to hide, when they're trying to forage, and there's not much eelgrass, which means there's probably less abundance of prey, meant that they just were having to dig or burrow themselves even more. And so that was much more noticeable in low density eelgrass than it was in high density. And so my conclusion there was just that we need to be more careful about protecting low density eelgrass, because like I said, once you lose eelgrass, it's very hard to get back. So protecting what's there and allowing it to recuperate or regenerate is super important.
Interesting. It's quite interesting to think that your lowest eelgrass areas, the ones you're already concerned about, are potentially the most vulnerable.
Mhm.
What about a difference between eelgrass beds that are the native eelgrass versus the invasive eelgrass? Have you heard any differences there?
I have not myself. I know that was actually something that a professor at Oregon State reached out to me about doing that study, about looking at the different effects between the different eelgrass species, but I don't know that it's actually been done yet. So I don't know if we know.
To be kind of interesting to see what they would find on that. I'm going to combine two questions here. Can you share a little bit more about like the life history of the green crab? Kind of if you have that available to you, like how long they stay in larval form, how far they get transported. And then the other question was, will they only settle out and be successful in estuaries, or are they found in the ocean as well?
Okay, yes. So man, I wish I could. So yes, green crabs, I believe, have, like I said, invaded coasts kind of on every continent that they are not native to since the 1800s, I would say. And so they are still being transported even up to this day. I read about a story of there being a shipment of worms that they came in on, and unknowingly those fishermen threw them into the water. So it just, I think part of it not being feasible for us to eradicate green crabs is that we are in such a global economy at this point that it's so we can ship things so quickly that it's very hard for us to catch when things are in there that should not be in there, and being able to catch things before they get established in a new place. What was the second part? What was the second question?
Oh, it was the two parts were like life cycle, like
Mhm.
kind of how long are they in larval form and all this stuff. And then the other one was do they live in the ocean as well as the estuary?
Oh yes.
So
They do. You are going to mostly find them in shallow waters. So estuaries and I think the rocky intertidal. They go to deeper water, but they're not going to be found out in the ocean. Yeah, that they won't be found in deep ocean water. They Let's see if I can recall their life cycle here for a second. They spend about a year in larval form, so then they call them kind of like young of year. So they start reproducing at about 2 to 3 years, I would say, and that all depends on like reproduction. There all depends on kind of like food availability and how like the environmental variables, so how warm the water is and things like that, that just make it yeah, more comfortable, I guess, for them to reproduce there. But yeah, they live for 6 years, so they are able to reproduce for about on average 4 years, I would say.
It's interesting. I'm still kind of basking in how, like you said, uncomfortable I feel about how hardy they are. And how even just removing the larger crabs showed a bump in the, yeah, I mean, that's just quite an aggressive species to be dealing with.
Yeah.
And is a daunting challenge. So yeah, I'm just reveling in that.
They are considered like a model invasive species, which is, I'm like,
quite the title.
yeah, I'm like, I don't know whether to, like whether to be impressed or not, it's just the amount of adaptation that they have accumulated, I guess, is quite
It's
impressive.
So I think the last question I'm seeing here is about the idea of opening a commercial harvest. And I know you talked about increasing bag limits, and Oregon does have the bag limit. Washington doesn't have a bag limit on green crabs, from what I understand. Is that, am I off on that? That's my own side question.
I believe Washington is not encouraging people to take out green crabs so much as they want people to report them.
Yeah.
So that they can come and monitor and take them out themselves, I believe is what
they want to do.
Yeah.
Okay. So a commercial, what have you heard of anybody talking about a commercial harvest? And I know from other invasive species where a commercial harvest has been opened up, it lends itself to its own complication, where an industry is created for something you want to get rid of.
Yeah,
and then
exactly.
you have people working in that industry that want to keep it going. So
yes. I have
anyway.
read about that. Yeah, but the West Coast is not currently interested in going that route, I would say, because like you said, you're creating an industry for that. And I don't think I'm not actually sure. I haven't, our populations are not at the level that the East Coast is right now. And hopefully they won't get to that point. But the East Coast is at the point where they need to be able to have some way of getting rid of these green crabs. And I don't think we are there yet. And I feel like hopefully we can, do enough mitigation that we don't get to that point. So yes, I would say they're still trying to hold off on the commercial
harvest. So I have one participant that wants to know if they can catch green crab and give them to the schooner, and I have some other folks cheering that idea on. I want to say first that I was just at a dinner at the schooner. Schooner's been doing some events and been inviting us as a guest to kind of share about bay health, and I actually promoted the idea of having a green crab themed to them before they even did it, and they could serve the whiskey and they could cook up some crab. But yeah, my guest came in, I'll see if you agree with this, is the schooner has to buy commercially harvested product, and so they probably can't catch it and give it to the schooner for them to cook.
Yes, and I didn't mention this either. There are some potential, currently, because they're not commercially harvested, they're also not tested for anything. So dangerous levels of dioxin or pathogens, things like that. So I would think that would probably be difficult to do for them.
I agree. Well, Allie does have a good point that we can host some green crab dinner events. So maybe there just needs to be like a Netarts potluck, and we can all try out the green crab cookbook.
I never tried any. I donated all of mine to the Great Pacific Octopus. So
you gave us some for dissections.
That's true.
That's fun. So if anybody has any last minute ideas, or if in the chat you would like to make your plans for your green crab potluck, go for it. But if you have any more last minute questions for Kim, please type them in the chat. Kim, I just want to say that I knew they were aggressive and I knew that they were damaging, but you gave me some additional facts about how hardy and damaging and aggressive they are that makes me much more aware of why it's such a problem. But thank you all for joining. It is just really wonderful to see you again, Kim, and get to hear about some of what you did in Netarts and also just hear about green crabs in general. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us tonight.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
You bet. All right, everybody, have a wonderful, wonderful night. Thank you all. And yeah, we'll see you on the bay.